Imagine if half of history had been written in whispers. Imagine kingdoms rising and falling, wars fought, discoveries made, while the voices of women were tucked into corners, hidden in kitchens, confined to silence. Yet those same women were always there, raising children, healing wounds, weaving revolutions in the shadows. Tonight, we journey across centuries to hear their stories, from ancient hearths to digital screens, and discover how women's roles, dismissed, diminished, yet always defiant, shaped the world as much as kings and conquerors ever did. Stay with me, because the history of women is the history of us all. A thread through time. Close your eyes and imagine the long sweep of history not as a straight road, but as a tapestry. Each age is a color, each culture a stitch, and through it all runs a thread both fragile and unbroken, the life of women. To trace it is to walk quietly beside countless figures, some named, most forgotten. A woman grinding grain on the banks of the Tigris, her hands powdered white with flour. A girl in Sparta, racing with bare legs under the sun, while her Athenian cousin sits cloistered behind a courtyard wall. A Roman matron adjusting her stola as she supervises her household, her voice echoing softly against marble. In each era, expectations wrapped around women like garments, sometimes heavy with gold, sometimes coarse with labor, always shaping the lives within them. They were mothers, daughters, midwives, weavers, rulers, scribes, lovers, saints, and exiles. At times revered as goddesses, at times dismissed as burdens, women lived at the very heart of societies while being told they were peripheral. Gender roles were never static. They bent and shifted like branches in the wind, sometimes offering shade, sometimes breaking under weight. Laws declared what a woman might own, whom she must marry, how her voice should be heard, or silenced. Customs dictated whether she was confined to home or free to roam markets and fields. Religion painted her as holy or sinful, pure or dangerous. Yet, across centuries and continents, certain constants remain. Women worked, whether at the spindle, the loom, the plow, or the ledger. They nurtured and taught, often quietly ensuring the survival of culture when war or famine threatened to erase it. Their strength was not always shouted, it was lived, embodied in daily tasks that seemed small but built the scaffolding of entire civilizations. As we move through time together, we'll step into their kitchens and temples, their workshops and palaces. We will hear what they might have whispered to each other, what burdens they bore, and what joys they found in fleeting moments. History may have recorded kings and conquerors more loudly, but if you lean close, you will hear the softer voices, the steady pulse of women's lives shaping the world in ways both seen and unseen. Ancient Mesopotamia, wives, priestesses, and scribes. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates carved a world of abundance and anxiety. In the shadow of mud-brick temples and towering ziggurats, women's lives unfolded beneath the weight of clay tablets inscribed with laws older than kings. Picture a woman in the city of Ur, her hair oiled and braided, her hands dusted from grinding barley. She is a wife, perhaps given in marriage by her father when she was barely past girlhood. The tablets tell us she came with a dowry, cloth, livestock, or perhaps a servant, that would remain hers even if her husband proved unkind. The law of Hammurabi declared protections. If her husband took another wife, she could return to her father's house with her dowry intact. Yet law also bound her, adultery was punishable by drowning, and obedience was expected as firmly as sunrise. But not every woman lived behind courtyard walls. Some stood at the very heart of religious life. Priestesses served in temples, tending fires, offering prayers, managing land that belonged to the gods. A high priestess, the Entu, could command respect equal to nobles. One such figure, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, etched hymns into clay, becoming the world's first known author. Her words still echo after 4,000 years, devotion to the goddess Inanna, carved in lines that survived floods, wars, and centuries of silence. There were also women who worked as tavern keepers, brewers, or midwives. Beer itself, the drink of the gods, was often brewed by women, sold in clay jars along bustling streets. The tavern keeper, often a woman, was both merchant and hostess, her house a place of laughter and suspicion, welcomed by some, frowned upon by scribes. And then there were the scribes. Rare, but not unknown. Some daughters of privilege learned the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform, recording transactions, prayers, and poetry. To hold the reed stylus was to hold power, and though most scribes were men, a handful of women pressed their voices into the clay, leaving behind a testament that they, too, could shape words as well as children. So, in Mesopotamia, a woman's life was at once constrained and expansive. Bound by the codes of fathers and husbands, yet able to rise as priestesses, poets, and keepers of sacred knowledge. She ground the grain, poured the beer, raised the children, but also prayed to the gods and, sometimes, spoke in their name. Her world was built of clay pots, clay walls, clay tablets. Fragile, yet enduring. Much like her place in history. Ancient Egypt, women as property holders and symbols of fertility. The Nile did not simply feed the fields, it fed a civilization where women enjoyed rights that, for centuries to come, would seem astonishing. The river's steady rhythm shaped a society in which women could own land, sign contracts, and even divorce husbands. Their lives were not equal to men's, but they were not shadows either. Imagine a woman in Thebes, her linen dress white against the gold of the sun. She walks to market with a basket of onions, a deed of property folded neatly in her hand. If her father has died, she may inherit his land. If she tires of her husband's neglect, she can return to the courts, her dowry returned to her without shame. Papyrus contracts, fragile but enduring, tell us of women who bought slaves, traded goods, and managed estates. Marriage in Egypt was not a ceremony of religion, but of agreement. Husband and wife entered a partnership, practical and public. Love poems etched in hieratic script speak of tenderness. My heart is in your hand, and you guard it. Yet behind the verses were negotiations of property, of inheritance, of lineage. Religion gave women another form of power. The goddess Isis, mother and protector, embodied both fertility and wisdom. Women, too, became priestesses, especially in service of Hathor, goddess of music and joy. They shook the sistrum, a bronze rattle whose sound was thought to chase away evil. In festivals they led songs, dance, and prayer, bridging the divine and the earthly. At the highest level of society, queens like Hatshepsut shattered expectation. She did not merely rule beside her husband or son, she crowned herself pharaoh, wore the false beard of kingship, and had her likeness carved in stone as though she were a man. Her reign was long, prosperous, and carefully remembered, though later rulers tried to erase her name. Even in erasure, she persisted. But for the majority of women, life was toil. They ground wheat, baked bread, fetched water from the river in clay jars heavy enough to bruise the hip. They tended children, stitched linen, wove baskets. Fertility was their constant burden, for the Nile's bounty could not prevent the fragility of childbirth. Amulets of Tauret, the hippo goddess of protection, dangled at their bedsides, a silent plea for survival. In Egypt, then, a woman's life was both ordinary and extraordinary. She walked under the same sun as her husband, but she walked with her own rights, her own name etched on contracts, her own prayers written on papyrus. The Nile's gift was abundance, and for women, that gift included a place, however fragile, in the legal and spiritual heart of society. Ancient Greece, behind doors in Athens, on the fields in Sparta. In Athens, the city that gave the world democracy, women lived most of their lives behind walls. A wife in Athens was a shadow within the household, her footsteps bound to the gynaeconitis, the women's quarters. Here she spun wool, prepared food, oversaw slaves, and bore children. She could not vote, could not speak in assembly, and rarely appeared in public except during festivals or funerals. Marriage was arranged, often when the girl was scarcely past childhood. A dowry passed from her father's house to her husband's, not as a gift but as security. If she were abandoned, the dowry returned with her, tethering her dignity to property. Athenian men married for heirs, but they sought companionship elsewhere, in symposia filled with wine and conversation, where courtesans, not wives, spoke freely. Yet Athens also gave women moments of visibility. At the festival of Dionysus, they processed in the streets, singing, dancing, bearing sacred objects. Plays of Euripides and Aristophanes echoed with women's voices, not their literal ones, but men's imaginings of them, lamenting, mocking, sometimes wise, sometimes wild. The stage revealed a paradox: women silent in politics, yet central in stories. Across the mountains in Sparta, life unfolded differently. Spartan women were raised to be strong, taught to run, to wrestle, to hurl javelins. They did not spin wool, they left that to slaves. They managed estates while their husbands marched off to war. When an Athenian once mocked a Spartan woman for speaking boldly, she replied, "We are the only women who give birth to men." Marriage customs, too, were unusual. A Spartan bride might have her head shaved and be dressed in men's clothing before being carried off to her new husband, a ritual echoing conquest. Yet once married, she enjoyed freedoms unknown to her Athenian sisters. She could inherit property, own land, and command households in her husband's absence. This difference puzzled and sometimes scandalized other Greeks. They whispered that Spartan women were immodest, too free with their tongues, too visible in public life. But it was this freedom that made them pillars of the Spartan state. When Leonidas marched to Thermopylae, he did so knowing that back home, women kept the hearths burning and the estates secure. So, within the same ancient land, two visions of womanhood coexisted. In Athens, the woman behind the door, unseen, unheard, yet vital in silence. In Sparta, the woman in the sunlight, training, managing, speaking, shaping the city's destiny. Ancient Rome, matrons, mothers, and power behind the toga. Step now into Rome, where marble columns rise against the sky and law orders every part of life. A Roman woman's world was both narrower and broader than her Greek sisters, limited by legal guardianship, yet infused with chances to wield quiet authority. The matrona, the ideal Roman wife, was a figure of dignity. Draped in her stola, she was expected to embody pudicitia, chastity, loyalty, modesty. Marriage again was less romance than alliance, binding families and fortunes. In early Rome, husbands held patria potestas, the father's power that could extend over wives and children alike. A woman might be passed like property from father to husband, from husband to son. Yet over time, the rigidity softened. By the late Republic and into the Empire, Roman women gained the right to own property, to manage estates, to inherit wealth. A widow, in particular, could emerge as a figure of financial independence. Freed from her guardian's hand, she might direct businesses, lend money, even fund temples and public works. Behind the scenes of politics, women whispered influence. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, was revered not for wielding office but for raising reformers. Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, steered imperial affairs with a steady hand, her advice echoing in the chambers where decisions of empire were made. And Agrippina, mother of Nero, played power like a harp, sometimes to triumph, sometimes to ruin. Religion, too, carved unique spaces for women. The Vestal virgins, chosen as children, kept the sacred flame of Vesta alight. Unlike other Roman women, they stepped beyond marriage and family into a life of public honor. Their word carried legal weight. Their bodies were symbols of Rome's purity. But their power was double-edged. To break their vows was to meet a terrible fate, buried alive within the city walls. In the crowded markets and along the muddy roads, humbler women toiled. Washerwomen bent over basins, sellers called out fish and fruit, midwives guided new lives into the world. Slaves filled the households of the wealthy, some suffering in silence, others rising to trusted positions. All contributed to the hum of Rome's daily life, though their names seldom made it into marble inscriptions. Rome spoke often of virtus, manly virtue, as though greatness belonged only to men. Yet woven through its centuries are stories of women who bent laws, managed legacies, and shaped the empire's future. In their shadowed ways, they were as much architects of Rome as the generals and senators who claimed the laurels. The medieval world, from cloister to cottage. As Rome's empire fractured and the Middle Ages unfolded, women's lives spread across a vast tapestry of roles, some cloistered in stone abbeys, some laboring in fields, some managing castles while husbands rode to war. For the peasant woman, life was bound to the soil. She rose with the sun, tended goats or sheep, gathered herbs, spun wool, baked coarse bread. Her body bore the weight of work and childbirth alike, her hands callous from harvest and hearth. Few possessions were truly hers, yet her labor sustained the manor as surely as any knight's sword. In towns and cities, women found new rhythms. Markets bustled with their voices, selling ale, weaving cloth, tending stalls. Some rose as guild members or apprentices, though most were barred from full membership. Widows often stepped into their husbands' trades, bakers, brewers, candlemakers, keeping businesses alive in their names. At the other end of the spectrum stood noblewomen. Marriage was once more alliance, castles exchanged for dowries, vows for political bonds. Yet when husbands rode to crusade or campaign, wives ruled estates, oversaw justice, managed vassals. Their signatures sealed charters, their decisions rippled through villages. Religion offered another path entirely. Within the stone walls of nunneries, women embraced, or were placed into, a life of prayer, study, and order. Some, like Hildegard of Bingen, rose as visionaries, composers, healers. Their voices, cloaked in divine authority, could reach across kingdoms even as their bodies remained within cloisters. Yet danger lingered. Medieval law and custom often circled women with suspicion. A midwife might be praised as a healer one year, accused of witchcraft the next. A widow might inherit wealth, only to be coerced into remarriage to secure it. Even queens faced perils, accusations of adultery, poison, sorcery, whenever politics demanded a scapegoat. Still, in the dim light of hearths, in convent gardens, in the counting rooms of estates, women preserved culture. They told stories by firelight, copied manuscripts, taught children prayers, planted seeds for the next harvest. They were keepers of continuity in an age that lurched between famine and feast, war and uneasy peace. The medieval world has often been painted as dark, but women's lives glowed with small lights, moments of laughter, love, prayer, and resilience that flickered against the shadows of their restrictions. The Islamic Golden Age, scholars, merchants, and voices within the veil. As the medieval West knelt in candlelit cathedrals, another world flourished beneath the domes and courtyards of the Islamic Golden Age. From Cordoba to Baghdad, from Cairo to Samarkand, cities pulsed with trade, scholarship, and faith, and within them, women carved out lives that both conformed to, and stretched against, the expectations of their age. Marriage and family life followed Islamic law, which granted women specific rights rare in contemporary Europe. They could own and inherit property, sign contracts, and initiate divorce under certain conditions. A bride's dowry was hers to keep, a safeguard written into faith itself. Still, practice often fell short of principle. Customs varied from region to region, and many women's freedoms were curtailed by social conservatism. In the home, women managed households, supervised servants, and raised children steeped in Quranic learning. Yet beyond the walls, some stepped into commerce. Records speak of women who traded spices, textiles, and perfumes, running stalls in bazaars or investing in caravans that crossed the desert. The Prophet Muhammad's own first wife, Khadija, had been a successful merchant, and her example lingered as both inspiration and shield for women who followed her path. In centers of learning, women were not absent. Some studied and transmitted hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, becoming respected scholars whose teachings were sought by men and women alike. Libraries preserved their works, though often their names faded into anonymity. Still, in mosque courtyards and private salons, their voices carried, shaping spiritual and intellectual life. Veiling and seclusion, often associated with this era, were practices more complex than they appear. For some women, the veil was a mark of dignity, a shield in public life. For others, it was a restriction imposed by class and circumstance, elite women secluded, while poorer women moved freely through markets and fields. The veil, like the role of women themselves, shifted across time, place, and interpretation. And always, there were exceptions. Queens and rulers emerged. Shajar al-Dur in Egypt, who took power in the 13th century, Sayyida al-Hura, a pirate queen of Morocco, feared across the Mediterranean. Their reigns were reminders that women could wield not only household authority but crowns and swords when history demanded. In poetry and song, too, women's voices lingered. Courtly verses penned by women in Al-Andalus celebrated love, longing, and wit, their words slipping like jewels across parchment. They remind us that beyond law and custom, women of this age lived fully human lives, negotiating duty and desire, silence and expression, within the rhythm of a civilization at its height. The Renaissance, learned ladies, courtesans, and the rebirth of voices. With the turning of the 15th century, Europe whispered of renascita, rebirth. Artists ground pigments, scholars unearthed ancient texts, and humanists declared that man was the measure of all things. Yet in the shadows of frescoed chapels and marble palaces, women asked quietly, "What of woman?" For most, life changed little. The farmer's wife still bent over fields, the washerwoman's arms still ached at the riverbank, the mother still bore children in darkened rooms. But for those born into wealth or proximity to power, new doors creaked open. The Renaissance rediscovered not only Plato and Aristotle, but also Sappho and Hypatia, reminding the learned that women had once held pens and lecterns. In the courts of Italy, learned ladies began to shine. Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua, gathered musicians, painters, and poets, her court a beacon of refinement. She corresponded with kings and popes, patronized the arts, and negotiated politics with a deftness equal to her male peers. Other women, like Vittoria Colonna, wielded poetry to explore both faith and longing, their verses resonating in salons and convents alike. Education for women remained controversial. Humanists debated whether a woman's mind could, or should, be trained in rhetoric and philosophy. Some argued that an educated woman was a danger, too bold, too unfeminine. Yet others penned treatises in their defense. Christine de Pizan's book of the City of Ladies constructed a symbolic fortress where women's virtue and intelligence were bricks of stone, proof against slander. Yet alongside queens and scholars stood another figure, the courtesan. In cities like Venice, she was both muse and scandal, weaving influence through wit and conversation. Some, like Veronica Franco, wrote poetry as sharp as any blade, challenging men to respect her words as much as her beauty. Though marginalized by morality, courtesans often gained freedoms denied to wives: literacy, independence, the power to choose lovers instead of being bartered into marriage. Religion, however, cast its own net. The Church still defined virtue through chastity and obedience. Women who stepped beyond those bounds, whether as artists, lovers, or thinkers, risked censure. Yet convents continued to nurture creativity. Nuns painted, composed music, and corresponded with theologians, their veils concealing but not silencing them. The Renaissance, so often painted as a dawn of brilliance, remained uneven for women. For every noblewoman penning a letter in Latin, countless others still toiled invisibly. And yet the spark was lit. The idea that women might learn, write, and shape culture had reemerged. Though dim, it glowed against centuries of silence, and it would not be easily extinguished. The early modern era, witches, wives, and women on trial. As Europe stepped into the 16th and 17th centuries, women's lives were tangled in contradictions. The printing press spread new ideas, voyages crossed oceans, and kingdoms wrestled for power. Yet for many women, this era was marked not by opportunity but by suspicion, an age where a single accusation could mean ruin, or worse, the stake. The household remained the center of expectation. A wife was to be obedient, her virtue her husband's honor. Manuals of conduct poured from presses, instructing women how to cook, sew, pray, and submit. Marriage, more than ever, was the axis around which her life turned. But in the turbulence of Reformation and war, widows often inherited businesses or managed estates, thrust into roles society claimed were not theirs, yet could not do without. At the edges of villages and in the corners of towns, midwives and healers tended to women's bodies with herbs, charms, and whispered prayers. For generations they had been keepers of knowledge, passing recipes for remedies from mother to daughter. Yet in this era, suspicion deepened. The same hands that soothed fevers or guided births were now accused of dealing with the devil. The witch trials swept across Europe with chilling force. Germany, Switzerland, Scotland, and beyond saw women dragged before courts, tortured into confessions, condemned by neighbors. Old age, poverty, sharp tongues, or simply being different could invite the accusation. To be a woman alone was often reason enough. While men were not immune, women bore the heaviest toll, tens of thousands executed, their bodies burned or broken as warnings. And yet, paradoxically, women were also stepping into intellectual and creative spaces. In England, Mary Sidney translated Psalms with elegance. In France, Marguerite de Navarre wrote tales of wit and faith. Some women became printers, running presses after their husbands' deaths. Others traveled as explorers' companions, their letters describing lands that most Europeans would never see. Still, the shadow of law loomed. Women remained legally tethered to fathers or husbands, their property absorbed into male hands. Divorce was nearly impossible, except in rare reformed regions. Education remained a privilege for the few, and most women's names vanished into parish records of births, marriages, and deaths. It was an age of fear, but also of sparks, of women who defied silence, who wrote, healed, and worked despite suspicion. Their resilience flickered against the darkness of trials and chains, and though many were silenced, their memory endures as testament to the precarious balance of life as a woman in early modern Europe. The Enlightenment, salons, science, and women's voices in the Age of Reason. The 18th century unfurled like a candlelit hall, its walls lined with books, its air humming with debate. Philosophers proclaimed the power of reason, of liberty, of progress. Yet while men filled academies and parliaments, women found their stage elsewhere, within the intimate glow of salons. In Paris, London, and Vienna, saloniers opened their homes to thinkers, poets, and scientists. Around polished tables, conversation flowed with wine and wit, and women acted not as silent hostesses but as arbiters of culture. Madame Geoffrin, Madame du Defa, and Julie de Lespinasse gathered the sharpest minds of their age, weaving connections that shaped literature and politics alike. To attend a salon was to step into a world where women's voices guided the rhythm of discourse. Education became a rallying point. Some thinkers, like Rousseau, argued that women should be educated only to please men, their minds shaped for service. Others, like Mary Wollstonecraft, raised their pens in fiery rebuttal. Her vindication of the rights of women demanded equality in learning, declaring that women were not ornaments, but rational beings deserving the same intellectual nourishment as men. Beyond salons and pamphlets, women ventured into science. Émilie du Châtelet translated Newton into French, her notes clarifying his principles for generations to come. Caroline Herschel swept the night skies with her brother, discovering comets that bore her name. Their achievements revealed that curiosity knew no gender, even if institutions refused them recognition. Still, limits remained. Women could not vote in the burgeoning experiments of democracy, nor claim seats in academies. Marriage laws tied their property and earnings to husbands. In much of Europe, legal identity dissolved into that of the man they wed. Yet cracks in the edifice of tradition grew wider with each passing decade. The Enlightenment also brought whispers of revolution. In America, women boycotted British goods, spun homespun cloth, and wrote appeals for liberty. In France, women marched to Versailles, demanding bread and justice, their footsteps shaking the cobblestones of monarchy. They carried banners as well as baskets, declaring that reason and freedom belonged to them as much as to men. It was a century of paradox, where women hosted the greatest minds yet were barred from their institutions, where they demanded rights and ink yet were told their place was still in the home. And yet, the Enlightenment planted seeds. Ideas once confined to ink and whispers would, in time, bloom into movements that reshaped the very meaning of womanhood. The industrial era, factories, reform, and the shifting burdens of labor. The 19th century dawned with smoke curling from chimneys and wheels turning in endless rhythm. The Industrial Revolution altered landscapes and lives alike, and women felt its tremors in their bones. Where once their labor was tied to hearth and field, now it was harnessed to machines. In crowded cities, women poured into factories, textile mills, matchstick plants, workshops where the air grew thick with dust and steam. They worked long hours for meager wages, their fingers quick, their spines bent. Some brought children with them, who crawled beneath machines to clear lint, their small bodies swallowed by iron. Factory bells dictated life, and exhaustion followed them home. For middle-class women, the script was different. The angel in the house became an ideal, pressing women into roles of domestic virtue, keepers of morality, guardians of home. While their poorer sisters toiled for pay, they were urged to embody gentleness, refinement, and selflessness. Yet even within parlors and drawing rooms, discontent stirred. The new wealth of industry funded education, philanthropy, and reform movements where women began to speak more boldly. Reformers raised their voices against injustice. In Britain, figures like Elizabeth Fry worked for prison reform. In America, Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman challenged both slavery and the oppression of women. Nurses like Florence Nightingale stepped onto battlefields, reshaping medicine with discipline and compassion. The world was beginning to see women in public roles not as scandal, but as necessity. Still, obstacles stood high. Property laws in many countries rendered married women invisible, their earnings swallowed by husbands. Universities barred their doors, declaring female intellect unfit for higher study. Votes were cast by men alone. Yet suffragists began to gather, their banners declaring that women's voices mattered in parliaments and assemblies. What began as petitions grew into marches, hunger strikes, and acts of defiance that would echo into the next century. The industrial era was one of contrasts: soot-stained faces in factories, lace collars in parlors, speeches in crowded halls. Women's labor built economies, women's care healed wounds, women's voices demanded justice. Though the smoke of industry sometimes seemed to choke progress, it also cleared a path, showing that women were not fragile ornaments, but essential pillars of a modernizing world. The Victorian Age: morality, constraint, and the cracks beneath the corset. Step now into the Victorian era, where streets thrummed with carriages and parlors glowed with gaslight. It was an age that draped itself in propriety, speaking often of morality, respectability, and restraint. Yet beneath the polished veneer, women's lives were filled with contradictions, anxieties about purity, passions hidden in diaries, and struggles against invisible chains. The ideal of the angel in the house reigned supreme. A woman was to be gentle, pious, submissive, her purpose to soothe her husband and raise virtuous children. Her world was domestic, her body laced into corsets, her movements bound by expectation. Middle-class households displayed her refinement like a jewel, proof of a man's prosperity that his wife need not labor outside the home. But for the poor, reality looked different. Working-class women scrubbed laundry, stitched garments in dim factories, or sold goods in crowded markets. Many bore the weight of double labor, earning wages while also tending children and home. For them, there was no polished pedestal, only survival. Even within respectability, cracks showed. Education for women began to expand. Schools and colleges cautiously opened their doors. Writers like the Bronte sisters, Elizabeth Gaskell, and George Eliot, Marian Evans, writing under a man's name, slipped past barriers, their novels exploring desire, injustice, and the complex interior worlds of women. Queen Victoria herself reigned as symbol of empire, though ironically she disapproved of women's suffrage, seeing it as unseemly. The women's rights movement swelled beneath the surface. Suffragists in Britain and America gathered in parlors and halls, crafting petitions, printing pamphlets, organizing marches. Figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Millicent Fawcett insisted that the vote was not a gift but a right. Their persistence grew into a movement that rattled governments. Meanwhile, the age wrestled with its own hypocrisies. Prostitution thrived in booming cities, even as society pretended to ignore it. The Contagious Diseases Acts in Britain subjected suspected women to invasive medical examinations, sparking outrage and protests led by Josephine Butler. The Victorian obsession with female virtue exposed its double standard, demanding purity of women while excusing the indiscretions of men. Behind lace curtains and locked diaries, women dreamed, doubted, and desired. They felt the tug of duty and the ache of constraint, but also the stirrings of a new world, one where their voices could not remain silenced forever. The corset might bind their bodies, but the cracks in that rigid frame were widening, and soon the stays would snap. The early 20th century, suffrage, war, and the first taste of equality. The dawn of the 20th century brought both turbulence and hope. Steamships shrieked in harbors, telegraphs clicked across continents, and women's voices rose louder than ever before. The suffrage movement, long simmering, now burst into the streets. In Britain, suffragists held banners aloft, patient and persistent in their petitions. But suffragettes, more militant sisters, chained themselves to railings, smashed windows, even set fires in protest. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters became both feared and admired, their motto ringing out, "Deeds, not words." Hunger strikes filled prisons. Force feedings left scars, both physical and moral. Across the Atlantic, in America, women like Alice Paul and Ida B. Wells demanded not only votes, but recognition that justice must extend across race and class. The Great War shifted the landscape. As men marched to battlefields, women stepped into factories, offices, and farms. They drove ambulances, served as nurses in makeshift hospitals, and kept nations breathing while trenches swallowed lives. The image of a woman at a lathe or plowing a field became a powerful reminder. They were not merely keepers of the hearth. They were workers, citizens, contributors. By war's end, governments could no longer ignore them. In 1918, British women over 30 gained the vote. By 1920, American women secured suffrage through the 19th Amendment. Other nations followed, sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly. It was a victory, though imperfect. Many women of color, working-class women, and colonial subjects remained excluded. Yet the principle had cracked through. Political equality was no longer unthinkable. Cultural shifts mirrored the political. The 1920s saw the rise of the flapper, short skirts swishing, hair bobbed, cigarettes lit in defiance. These young women claimed public spaces once deemed improper, dancing in jazz halls, earning wages, and speaking with newfound frankness about love and independence. It was rebellion wrapped in silk and sequins, a symbol of women shaking loose the old scripts. Still, resistance remained strong. Traditionalists railed against unwomanly ambitions. Marriage laws still curtailed independence, and pay for women remained a fraction of men's. But the trajectory had shifted. For the first time in centuries, the tide flowed toward women not just as private figures in homes, but as public actors in politics, work, and culture. The early 20th century was not the end of struggle, but the first taste of recognition. Women had fought, bled, and starved for their rights, and though the world still hesitated to grant them full equality, the foundation was laid. The century ahead would test, expand, and redefine those victories. The world wars, total war, and women's expanded roles. When the Second World War erupted, it swept away any lingering doubts about whether women could shoulder burdens once thought exclusively male. Factories that once built bicycles now churned out bombers, and it was women who riveted their frames, tested engines, and worked assembly lines with relentless precision. The image of Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled up, bicep flexed, became iconic, not just in America but across many nations where women filled industrial gaps. In Britain, they joined the Women's Land Army, tending fields and driving tractors, ensuring soldiers abroad were fed. In Soviet Russia, women went beyond factories. They became snipers, pilots, and tank drivers, their courage woven into the brutal fabric of the Eastern Front. Yet the transformation wasn't only about labor. Women took to the skies as ferry pilots, transporting aircraft across dangerous routes. Others decoded enemy communications in dimly lit rooms, their minds working silently to alter the course of battles. Nurses braved front lines, setting up tents in mud and rubble, treating wounds under the whine of artillery. For millions, the war was the first time society openly acknowledged their indispensable role in national survival. But recognition came with contradictions. Governments praised women's service while often reminding them it was temporary, a duty that would end when peace returned. Propaganda posters celebrated strong, working women during wartime, only to urge them back into domestic life when the men returned. Still, the war cracked doors open that could not fully be shut again. Women had managed farms, kept industries alive, run households alone, and made decisions without husbands or fathers present. They had proven their resilience on a scale the world had never seen. And yet, the post-war years revealed both advancement and retreat. In some countries, women gained voting rights and broader legal recognition. In others, they were quietly pressured to return to kitchens and nurseries, as governments promised stability by restoring traditional family roles. But the taste of independence lingered. A woman who had flown a bomber or directed a factory shift did not easily forget her capabilities. The wars forced society to see what had long been denied, that women were not auxiliary to history, they were part of its beating heart. The mid-20th century, domestic ideals and the seeds of change. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the echoes of war followed women back into homes across the globe. Governments and media worked tirelessly to restore a sense of normalcy, and that normalcy was defined in part by women returning to kitchens, nurseries, and suburban living rooms. In America and Western Europe, the 1950s saw the rise of the domestic ideal. Glossy magazines and television shows showcased radiant housewives in tailored dresses, smiling as they presented casseroles to their families or polished furniture until it gleamed. The suburban home, filled with new appliances, became the emblem of stability and prosperity. Women were praised for being the moral and emotional centers of these households, guardians of comfort in an uncertain nuclear age. Yet beneath the surface, dissatisfaction stirred. Women who had once riveted steel, flown planes, or managed farms found the monotony of housework stifling. Betty Friedan would later capture this restlessness in her groundbreaking 1963 book The Feminine Mystique, describing the problem that has no name, a sense of emptiness among women who had everything society said should make them happy. Globally, women's roles in the mid-20th century were uneven. In the Soviet Union, women remained central to both labor and family life, often expected to balance industrial work with domestic duties. In newly independent nations across Africa and Asia, women navigated both opportunities and constraints, taking part in nationalist struggles yet often finding themselves excluded from political power once independence was achieved. Culturally, the post-war years were marked by contradictions. Advertisements glamorized housework while selling products meant to save time. Education expanded for girls, yet many were still steered toward teaching, nursing, or secretarial work, the acceptable, feminine professions. In many societies, marriage was seen not just as desirable but as essential, and a woman who remained unmarried risked stigma. Still, cracks in the domestic facade widened. The civil rights movement in the United States, decolonization abroad, and shifting cultural landscapes all seeded questions about power, equality, and freedom. Women's magazines began to feature letters from readers asking, "Is this all?" Even as society praised domesticity, the seeds of second-wave feminism were quietly taking root. The world was on the cusp of another great transformation in gender roles, one driven not by necessity, like wartime, but by women themselves demanding recognition, autonomy, and change. The second-wave feminism and the struggle for equality, 1960s, 1980s. By the 1960s, the quiet unease that had lingered in kitchens and suburban neighborhoods burst into a collective voice. If the first wave of feminism had secured the vote in many nations, the second wave sought to redefine the very structures of society: work, education, family, and personal freedom. The rallying cry was simple yet revolutionary. The personal is political. Issues once dismissed as private, childcare, domestic labor, reproductive rights, even marital expectations, were reframed as matters of systemic inequality. Women were no longer content to be praised for keeping tidy homes. They wanted fair wages, control over their own bodies, and the chance to shape public life on equal terms. In the United States, organizations like the National Organization for Women, NOW, push for legal reforms, from equal employment opportunities to protections against gender discrimination. In 1973, the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade established the right to abortion, giving women unprecedented control over reproductive choices, though it remained contested and politically volatile. Across Europe, women's movements organized strikes, marches, and consciousness-raising groups. In France, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex had already laid philosophical groundwork, arguing that women were made, the other, by male-dominated structures. In Scandinavia, progressive policies began to take shape: parental leave, childcare support, and workplace protections that sought to balance family and career. The 1970s and 1980s also saw expansion in higher education and professional opportunities for women. More entered law, medicine, academia, and politics, though often facing hostility and bias. The glass ceiling became a phrase used to describe invisible barriers blocking women from top positions, even as they filled lower and middle ranks. But the movement was not without fractures. White, middle-class women often dominated its leadership, leading to critiques from women of color, working-class women, and those outside the West. Figures like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde reminded the world that feminism must confront not just sexism but also racism, classism, and homophobia. Meanwhile, media often portrayed feminists as angry, humorless, or anti-family, reducing their arguments to caricatures. Yet the persistence of activists reshaped laws, workplaces, and cultural conversations. By the close of the 1980s, the world was undeniably different: more women in universities, more in politics, more demanding their place as equals. Still, the struggle was, and remains, unfinished. The second wave built foundations, but it also exposed the depth of resistance to change. For every advance, there were battles yet to come. The late 20th century, globalization, new challenges, and the rise of third-wave feminism, 1990s, 2000s. By the 1990s, the social landscape had shifted once again. The momentum of second-wave feminism had reshaped laws and workplaces, but the next generation found itself grappling with different questions. Women were no longer fighting simply to be present in public life. They were challenging how gender itself was understood. This period marked the rise of third-wave feminism, often described as more inclusive, more global, and more skeptical of rigid definitions. Where the second wave had often centered the struggles of white, middle-class women in the West, the third wave emphasized diversity: women of color, LGBTQ+ voices, indigenous women, and activists from the global South insisted their stories be heard. The slogan was no longer just equality with men, but also recognition of difference. Popular culture became a battleground. Riot girl bands like Bikini Kill used punk rock to rail against sexism, violence, and cultural silencing. Television and film began to show women in more varied roles, from action heroes to complex professionals, though stereotypes persisted. The media also made icons of women who blurred boundaries. Madonna, for instance, flaunted sexuality on her own terms, provoking debates about empowerment versus exploitation. Globalization complicated gender roles further. Economic shifts meant that in many households, women became primary breadwinners, especially as manufacturing jobs declined and service industries expanded. Women entered universities in record numbers, often outpacing men in graduation rates. Yet wage gaps stubbornly persisted, and in many regions, traditional expectations of marriage and family life still weighed heavily. In developing countries, women confronted another set of realities. Microfinance projects aimed at empowering women in South Asia and Africa gave rise to both praise and critique. While they offered independence to some, they also risked burdening women with debt without addressing systemic inequalities. Activists also highlighted violence against women, domestic abuse, human trafficking, and wartime sexual violence, demanding global recognition that women's rights are human rights. As famously declared at the 1995 UN conference in Beijing. Technology added new dimensions. The Internet connected women across borders, creating forums for solidarity and activism. At the same time, it introduced fresh dangers, online harassment, the rapid spread of misogyny, and new forms of exploitation. The late 20th century was thus a paradox. Women had more visibility, education, and opportunity than ever before, yet the promise of full equality remained elusive. The third wave insisted that liberation must mean freedom for all women, not just a select few, and that gender could not be separated from race, class, sexuality, or global context. The seeds of a new century had been planted, and they would soon grow into movements that blurred the line between physical streets and digital screens. The 21st century, digital feminism, #MeToo, and shifting gender roles. The dawn of the 21st century brought with it not just new technologies but also new ways of organizing voices. Where earlier generations had rallied in streets or university halls, women of the digital age found their battlegrounds on blogs, social media platforms, and online communities. Activism no longer needed a printing press or a town square. It could trend in hours, sweeping across continents with a hashtag. The #MeToo movement, which erupted in 2017, marked a watershed moment. What began as a phrase coined by activist Tarana Burke years earlier gained global momentum after high-profile revelations of sexual harassment and abuse. Millions of women shared their stories, breaking silences that had lasted lifetimes. The sheer scale of testimony revealed not isolated incidents, but systemic patterns of exploitation that spanned industries, nations, and cultures. For perhaps the first time in history, women's private pain became public reckoning on a global scale. Digital feminism expanded beyond #MeToo. Campaigns addressed issues like pay inequality, reproductive rights, online harassment, body shaming, and the policing of women's identities. Movements such as #YesAllWomen, #TimesUp, and region-specific campaigns like Ni Una Menos in Latin America highlighted both shared struggles and culturally unique battles. The Internet gave rise to solidarity, but also exposed deep divisions between generations, between radical and liberal approaches, and between differing visions of what equality should mean. At the same time, gender roles in the 21st century began shifting in more complex ways. In many societies, men took on more active roles in childcare, and conversations about paternity leave became more mainstream. In workplaces, diversity initiatives attempted to address glass ceilings, though progress was uneven. The recognition of non-binary and transgender identities further challenged older definitions of gender, expanding conversations once narrowly framed as men versus women into broader questions of identity and inclusion. Yet resistance remained fierce. Backlashes against feminism appeared online and in politics, fueled by populist rhetoric and anxieties about social change. Women who spoke up often faced harassment, threats, or dismissal. In some countries, hard-won reproductive rights were rolled back, proving that progress was never linear. Despite these obstacles, the 21st century underscored one truth: women's voices could no longer be ignored. Whether in the corridors of power, the trending pages of Twitter, or the crowded streets of protest marches, they were shaping global conversations about justice, dignity, and equality. The digital age made feminism louder, faster, and more interconnected than ever before. But it also revealed that the work of redefining gender roles is an ongoing journey, not a destination. The contemporary era, intersectionality, global struggles, and new visions of equality. As the 21st century moved deeper into its second decade, the word intersectionality became central to discussions of women's lives and gender roles. Coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 20th century, it emphasized how gender could not be understood in isolation. Race, class, sexuality, disability, and global position all shaped the experiences of women differently. A woman's struggle for equality in New York was not the same as that of a woman in Nairobi, Mumbai, or Sao Paulo, yet threads of solidarity wove their stories together. In the global South, women led movements against authoritarian governments, corruption, and gender-based violence. In India, protests against sexual assault brought sweeping public debate and changes in law. In Latin America, women marched by the millions under banners like Ni Una Menos, demanding an end to femicide. In Africa, women played key roles in peacebuilding, from Liberia's grassroots peace movement led by Lema Boye to local initiatives combating child marriage. At the same time, conversations around gender roles expanded beyond the binary. Transgender and non-binary voices increasingly reshaped the feminist landscape, insisting on recognition, healthcare rights, and freedom from violence. These demands sometimes cause tension within movements, but they also push feminism to confront its blind spots and reimagine inclusivity. Technology continued to be both weapon and shield. Social media amplified voices, spread campaigns, and created spaces for marginalized perspectives. Yet it also served as a breeding ground for harassment, deepening concerns about online safety. Women journalists, activists, and politicians frequently faced coordinated abuse, raising urgent questions about how freedom of expression could coexist with protection from harm. Meanwhile, workplaces evolved under pressure. Companies and institutions began to adopt diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, though critics often accused them of tokenism rather than genuine reform. Debates about childcare, parental leave, and work-life balance persisted, with the COVID-19 pandemic highlighting stark inequalities as millions of women left jobs to shoulder increased family responsibilities. The contemporary era has revealed a striking duality: historic progress in education, political representation, and global awareness of women's rights, and at the same time, persistent barriers, violence, and backlash. Gender roles are no longer static, yet they remain contested terrain. What unites these struggles is the growing refusal of women, and allies across genders, to remain silent. Whether in classrooms, parliaments, or digital town squares, women continue to demand not just a place at the table, but a reimagining of the table itself. Looking ahead, the future of women's lives and gender roles. The story of women's lives has never been one of straight lines or simple progress. It is a story of cycles, steps forward, pushbacks, reinventions, and revolutions. As we look toward the future, the question is not whether women will continue to shape history, but how society will adapt to the ever-shifting landscapes of gender, power, and identity. Technology will play a defining role. Artificial intelligence, automation, and digital economies are changing the very nature of work. This raises pressing concerns. Will women have equal access to these new industries, or will old inequalities replicate themselves in new forms? Already, women are leading in areas such as climate activism, digital entrepreneurship, and grassroots movements. Yet they also remain disproportionately affected by poverty, climate disasters, and political instability. Education remains a cornerstone. Around the globe, girls' access to schooling has improved, but in some regions it remains fragile, threatened by conflict, cultural traditions, or economic barriers. The empowerment of women through knowledge will continue to determine not just their personal futures, but the futures of their families, communities, and nations. Culturally, gender roles will likely become even more fluid. The rise of non-binary and transgender recognition suggests that rigid categories of male and female will continue to soften, opening possibilities for broader understandings of identity. For some, this promises liberation; for others, it provokes discomfort and resistance. The future will almost certainly be shaped by how societies negotiate these tensions. Globally, women will remain at the forefront of struggles for justice, whether against authoritarianism, environmental collapse, or economic inequality. Their activism has shown time and again that when women rise, entire societies shift. The challenge will be ensuring that progress is not limited to a privileged few, but reaches across borders, classes, and communities. Perhaps most importantly, the future demands imagination. To move beyond centuries of confinement, women, and men, must envision roles untethered from outdated hierarchies. The fight is not only for equality but for a rebalancing of human potential, where nurturing is valued alongside strength, where care is recognized as essential labor, and where every individual can contribute without fear of dismissal or diminishment. History has taught us that gender roles are never fixed. They bend, break, and rebuild. And as long as women continue to raise their voices, write their stories, and live their truths, the future will carry echoes of resilience and renewal, shaping a world not yet seen, but already stirring.